Jarrett sat in his apartment, a drink close to hand, as he set up to make his last video. He kept glancing at the corner, the pocket of darkness seeming unaffected by the studio lights he had set up. He didn't dare let his eyes linger there for too long. He might see them, and then all would be lost. They had been after him for a while now, been after him ever since she had brought that darkness into his life. Jarrett tried to push that thought away. That was the lack of sleep and too much alcohol talking. He couldn't let her change him, couldn't let her win. It had been 6 months since his career had fallen apart. He had once been a big star, the darling of YouTube, well on his way to being one of the greatest musicians of his age. Then Crystal had appeared, and they had come with her. He still remembered the first time they had met. Crystal had been dating one of the actors on Saturday Night Live when Jarrett had been their musical talent and guest host. That had been while his star was still on the rise. That had been when he could still depend on getting 3 million views on any YouTube video he put up. He had quickly found her beside him in the green room, laughing at his jokes, flirting with him shamelessly. Jarrett was used to women flirting with him, but Crystal was different. All the girls before her had been hangers-on, girls content to ride his stardom. Crystal had dreams, aspirations, and after talking with her for a few hours, Jarrett had found himself smitten. She left with him that night, and within a week, she was sharing his bed. That was the first night he'd seen them. They had fallen into bed together, her drunk and laughing, and Jarrett buzzed and singing something he'd made up to make her laugh, when their lips had come together. They hadn't separated until they had fallen into an exhausted pile of sweaty bodies. She had fallen asleep, her body warm against his, and Jarrett had reached shakily to turn off the lamp by his bed. His head had been spinning a little, still drunk off the afterglow and the beer he had had earlier, when he glanced at the corner and pulled his hand back like he'd touched a hot stove. It had been there in the corner for just a second, a grinning dark thing with no eyes and a mouth full of far too human teeth. He swiped his face with his hand, trying to make his eyes focus, and when he looked back, the thing had been gone. Jarrett slept, but he slept with the lights on that night. Now he slept with the lights on most every night. "Hey there," he said, flipping his hair out of his face as he stared blearily into the camera. It's me. I've been thinking about this song for a while now, and I think I'm finally ready to play it." He picked up his guitar and played the first note. It sounded terrible. His guitar hadn't been tuned in a very long time. It didn't matter, he supposed. Anything he played would sound amazing. Although these days, it was all amazingly depressing. His upbeat and snappy songs that were once hummed by high school kids had become dark and brooding, fit only for the back rooms of clubs and the dimly lit bedrooms of emo kids. That had always been his power, though. He played what was inside him, and he played it well. If his songs were dark, then it was a reflection of him. The tune jangled like a dying thing, but Jarrett played on regardless. Their relationship had been rocky almost from the start. Crystal liked to drink, and Jarrett didn't. Crystal liked to get high. Jarrett didn't. Crystal liked to get drunk and high and start fights with Jarrett in public places, ensuring that her face would be on the cover of the next day's tabloids. This was the sort of fame she was after. A sloppy train wreck sort of fame that made you more infamous than famous. Jarrett had grown up in a small town with a good family, and this sort of thing was new to him. He had never so much as seen his father raise his voice to his mother, and the thought that his mother might strike his father was more alien than her slitting his throat while he slept. Jarrett was in a situation he didn't understand, but he made the best of it, as best as he could. After 6 months of this, Jarrett threatened to call it off with her, but this would prove to be a pattern with them. Crystal would cry and leave, saying Jarrett didn't need her around and how much better he'd be without her, and then Jarrett would miss her, blaming himself for their troubles. Then Crystal would send him a text a few days later, and they would fall back together like puzzle pieces. Then she would repeat it a few months later, and the cycle would continue, again and again. In hindsight, it was easy to see that he'd been in an abusive relationship, but it's harder to see things like that from the inside. It's hard to tell a lot of things, until you're staring at the end. As the fighting and the hurting went on, they just kept coming back. He would see them out of the corner of his eye. He would see them in the dark corners of his house. He would see them standing on the street corner as his cab drove between clubs and venues. They followed him. They wanted him. But for some reason, they didn't like to hang around while he played music. His music was upbeat, hopeful, and the little monsters didn't seem to like the sound of it. He never saw them in the places where he performed, and it was the only respite from their leering mouths that he found. As his song jangled on, though, he could see them now. They gathered in the corners of his dingy apartment. They grinned at him from the shadows of his kitchenette. As the song went on, his acoustic guitar sounded like a dying animal as he sang in a husky, whiskey-soaked voice. He saw them coming closer as he baked under the single stage light. He was tired of running. He was ready for them to catch him. She had claimed that she left him, but it had been Jarrett who finally ended it. He'd had enough of the fighting. He'd had enough of the apologies, and he'd had enough of her adding controversy to what was otherwise a drama-free life. She had come to start a fight with him, the tabloids having moved on from her last public explosion, and he put her out. He said it was over. He said they were through, and he said she needed to leave. The police had ended up being called to remove her, but she wasn't done by a long shot. His song came to a close, his guitar sounding almost glad to be done as it rattled to silence. "Thanks for listening," Jarrett said, wiping his eyes as he became aware that he'd been crying as he played. "If you're still watching, I'd like to let you know that this will be my last song. I want to thank all my fans, everyone who supported me through the years and through all the pain, but this will be it for me. Whatever spark I had is gone, and the music is just another reminder of what I've lost. Thanks for listening, and have a great life." He reached up and turned off the camera, the world not needing to witness the things that swarmed around him. His last thoughts were of Crystal, and those thoughts were filled with a blistering rage. Crystal had not gone quietly. She had come back with accusations of abuse. Jarrett had been abusive. Jarrett had been physically violent with her. She had pictures and bruises, and at the end of the day, people had believed her. Well, not believed her, but everyone loves a train wreck, don't they? The more he fought against the accusations, the more guilty it was decided that he looked. Though cleared in the court of law, he was tarnished in the court of public opinion. Crystal would go on to publish a book about her experience, write and sing her own music, and take a tour of talk shows as she told her story. Jarrett climbed into the bottle, and when he'd come out, the creatures had been his only friends. Maybe you can help me with something before I go," he said, and the little buggers stopped in their tracks. Jarrett looked at them through the swoop of his long hair, surprised. He had never talked to them before. He had never even tried to reason with them. They had hounded him for years, but maybe all he had needed to do was acknowledge them. They were now the closest thing he had to companionship. When in hell, maybe you just had to enjoy the heat. "I don't know what your plans are for me, but I'd like to take one more person along for the ride if I can. Think you can help me with that?" As they whispered in his ear, his lips splitting into a ghoulish grin, Jarrett found that they could help him. Jarrett found, in fact, that they were happy to help him. He dialed Crystal's number as a new song popped into his head. He laughed a mad laugh that sounded like tittering from an insane asylum. As the voicemail picked up, Jarrett left his last message to the world. He tried to hold in his laughs, the sound already becoming less than human, but it was hard. He could feel the cold metal biting into his palm, but he didn't think they had realized it was there yet. Maybe they didn't care either. Perhaps his death would be enough for them. One more light extinguished from the world. Jarrett sang his dirge as he rocked on the edge of the bathtub, the water a gentle chorus behind him. It was the best performance he'd ever given, the best one in years, and when it was over, he hung the phone up and let it slip from his hand. It fell into the water with a metallic snark as it died at the bottom. They stepped towards him, now a large crowd of barely contained darkness, but he smiled back at them in triumph. "Sorry, kids. Not today," he said. He whipped the razor across his arm, cutting deep as he tumbled into the bath. He heard the lead creature scream in angry humor, and suddenly the swarm was upon him. He fell into the tub, his vision obscured by the red and wavery translucence, as a tide of black pushed him down to join his cell phone. They swarmed around him, chuckling in a watery way as the liquid filled his lungs. They might end his life, but they wouldn't have him. On a baser level, he knew they meant to add him to their ranks of shadowy, smiling devils, and Jarrett wouldn't have it. He may not have been allowed to live on his own terms, but he would damn sure die on them. He died, surrounded by the laughter one hears in hell. Crystal stepped out of the car and walked up the steps of her home in West L.A. It had been a good funeral. Lots of people there to see her being sad and see her paying her respects to a man who had made her career. Whether she wanted to admit it or not, Jarrett had been the best thing to happen to her in years. She'd been a rising star. She'd ridden him to heaven so that she could watch him fall. It was cold, but hey, it was showbiz. She felt her phone rattle inside her purse and remembered that she had set a reminder for tonight. She had spent too much time out mourning with the other beautiful people and had almost forgotten her promise to her public. Jarrett's video, biography, and anything else that dealt with her life was trending high today. And Jarrett, it seemed, had left her one last boost in popularity before he stepped out. She set the scene before she went live. She poured herself a fashionable drink, slipped into something a little less depressing, and found a place to lounge. This could be her last chance to cash in on her ex-boyfriend, and she meant to monopolize it to the fullest. Jarrett's star might have fallen, but her own could still rise higher. Who knew? This video might even change the world. She flounced her hair a little, trying for that crossroads of casual and effortlessly hot, and pressed live on her laptop. Good evening, everyone. As you all know, Jarrett's funeral was today. I've cried for him since I got up this morning, and I can't think of anything more fitting to honor his memory than to play the last song he ever sang. She reached up and smudged her mascara a little. Raccoon eyes always played well for the camera. Let me play you the message that he left again, in case any of you missed it yesterday. That was crap, of course. No one had missed his message last night. She could already see the eyes on her, and 20,000 people were watching already. All of them had liked and shared last night's broadcast. She was sure of it. Now they were all coming back for the money shot, and she wasn't about to let them down. She pulled out her phone and pressed play as she held it close to the screen. Jarrett's voice poured through the speakers, and she had to stop herself from shuddering when she heard it. The Jarrett she knew had never yelled, never really raised his voice to her, and certainly never raised a hand to her. He was a nice guy, and there had been times that she had felt a little bad about the things she accused him of. Even when they fought, he never put his hands on her, or let his voice rise higher than a monotone. It was how his mother had taught him to be, and he had never forgotten how a man should treat a lady. This Jarrett, however, wasn't the one she had known. He sounded wrong. He sounded cruel. This Jarrett sounded like he might hit her, sounded like he might scream in her face, and sounded like he might enjoy killing her for no better reason than she deserved it. She had watched him after his fall, watched the sad Jarrett who made depressing ballads and soft emo music. That Jarrett had been hard to watch. This Jarrett was something else. This Jarrett was the one who would have done the things that she'd accused him of doing. Hello, Chris. I guess you're too busy to talk to me, so just listen. I've written you a song. Remember when I used to do that? It's just for you, so make sure you don't share it with anybody else. Something you can remember me by after I'm gone. As the message ended, she composed her face and went on. I guess he never quite got over me. The time of death on his police report was minutes after this message ended. It's kind of sweet that his last thoughts were of me.
I haven't listened to the song yet. I thought I'd share it with all of you on the eve of his funeral. Let's send his soul off with one last happy tribute. This one's for you, Jarrett. I hope you've found peace, wherever you are." She pressed play on the next message, and the song started almost at once. It was sung a cappella, and she was surprised that he hadn't used any instruments. His last song, Birds of Paradise, had been sad and depressing, but this song was clearly something darker, something more personal. It was about her. Of that, she was sure. It was full of angry discourse and jagged discords. This new Jarrett wasn't holding anything back, had nothing to hold back, and the song was an angry dirge that scraped across her nerves. It almost seemed like in the background, someone was laughing too. If she listened closely, she could hear canned animatronic laughter that cut through Jarrett's pseudo-screamo. The song lasted about 3 minutes, and when the line finally went dead, Crystal was glad for it. The tears that streamed down her face now were real, and she could see from the comments that she wasn't the only one crying. She composed herself and tried to end this video without sounding as uncomfortable as she felt. Now that it was over, she wished that no one else had heard it. It had been so personal. It had been Jarrett airing their dirty laundry, and she felt embarrassed to have others hear it. He had talked about so many things she hadn't known he had known, and things that might look bad on her if he brought them to light. She would have to do a little damage control now. She would have to wait for the fires to spring up. She rubbed her eyes again and found them wet. I hate that things had to end this way. Despite how he treated me, Jarrett was my best friend once. I thought, not too long ago, about being with him for the rest of my life. I imagined us having kids, singing on stage together, growing old together, living out our golden years in each other's arms. I hate that this is how it had to end. I hate that I couldn't have been there to stop him from taking his own life. I hate that... She thought for a moment that something moved in the corner. She looked over quickly, afraid that maybe some fan had come in to crash her live stream. But it was just the thick curtains over the bay window. I hate that we couldn't make things work. If you or someone you know is contemplating suicide, I'll link the suicide prevention hotline below. Don't let someone else end like this. Jarrett was too talented to... She heard a rasp of something directly on her left, but when she turned to look, there was nothing there. What the hell had that been? She lost her train of thought, but she hoped it would come off as her being distraught over the song. To end up like this. Get help before it's too late. I'm gonna go. I need to be alone after all this. But I hope that you have a good evening, and remember to be good to each other. She signed off. When she was sure that the camera was dead, she called Ronaldo at the front gate. "Yes, Miss Maldonado. Ronaldo, there's something in my house. I'm going upstairs to take a long bath, and I want you and your men to comb through the house and find out what it is." "Do you suspect that it's a person or an animal, or..." "I suspect that I pay you way too much to ask stupid questions. Get in here, search the house, and find whatever it is." She hung up on him and went upstairs to her bedroom, locking the door behind her. The tub was massive, big enough for 3 in fact, and it was part of the reason that Crystal had bought the house. She loved nothing so much as soaking in her tub and letting the world float by. She could hear Ronaldo moving around downstairs as she stripped off her clothes and let a heady sigh escape her as she sank into the warm water. She put her hair in a long tail and let it hang over the edge as she let the heat settle on her skin and pushed the button for the jets. Crystal had a long day of schmoozing and networking, topped off by a terrible song from Jarrett, and now she wanted to relax. when the chuckle crawled into her ears. She rolled over in the water and stared around the bathroom. The jets were like mini airplane engines in her ears, and there should have been no way that she could hear anything. She looked over the small room before sinking back into the warm water. She let her mind relax, her body floating beneath the surface, as the soothing jets massaged her back and arms, ridding her body of the tension she had carried all, when someone grabbed and yanked her ponytail. She spun around and put her back to the opposite wall of the garden tub. Her eyes moved like a trapped animal's, but she saw nothing. She turned off the jets and toweled off. She suddenly didn't feel like relaxing anymore. She was in bed an hour later when the shadows began to gather. She had Ronaldo search the whole house twice, but neither he nor his security men found anything. She sat in her bed the whole time, blankets pulled up to her chin, as they moved about her room, her bathroom, her closets, and checked every room upstairs and downstairs. The sun was setting when Ronaldo came back to report, but his news was far from satisfactory. They'd found nothing, less than nothing. They'd found no means of entry, forced or otherwise, and except for her coming in with the keys earlier, no one had been in or out of the house since she'd left for the funeral. The cameras and sensors had found nothing. She was alone, as far as anyone knew. That's impossible. Someone pulled my ponytail. Now either it was you or one of your security guys playing a joke. Either way, I don't appreciate it. Ronaldo looked apprehensive for a moment before saying what was on his mind. Are you sure that maybe you didn't just get it hung on something? Crystal narrowed her eyes at him. Are you asking me if I know the difference between having my hair pulled and getting it tangled on something? No, ma'am, but you have seemed to be under some stress lately. Maybe you're just jumping at shadows, being paranoid. Is that what you think, Ronaldo? He shrugged. There's no one in your house, ma'am. We're sure of it. She waved a hand at him. Then you can go. You can all go. Ronaldo raised an eyebrow. You don't want a night detail left behind? Did I stutter? Go! Since you all think I'm going nuts, I wouldn't expect any of you to stay behind and have me waste your time. Get out of here. I don't need your services tonight. Maybe not ever again. Ronaldo looked disappointed, but he did as he was told. When the door closed behind him, she wished he had stayed. The house seemed very quiet now that they were gone, and she hunkered under the covers like a child as she tried to sleep. Maybe he was right. Perhaps all she needed to alleviate some of this stress was a good night's sleep. She was on the cusp of something great. She could feel it, and she couldn't afford to let the stress get to her now. As she felt her eyes getting heavy, though, she could hear Jarrett's last song, and it let her down into a dream of him. She sat in a small coffee shop, sitting alone in a dark room full of murmurs. The other tables were cast in pale circles of gloom, but beyond them was a darker area that she didn't like to think about. It almost seemed to move if she gazed at it, and it made her very uncomfortable. Things were watching her from that darkness, and they didn't like her at all. The stage lights came on then, and there was Jarrett. He was sitting on the stage with an old acoustic guitar that his granddad had given him, strumming away and humming to himself. She never understood what he saw in that battered old thing, but she had never had any grandparents to give her a guitar, so maybe it was beyond her understanding. She had tried to get rid of it more than once. He had so many expensive guitars to play, but he always refused. Sometimes she'd catch him on the porch, strumming away and looking wistful. Today, though, he was singing the song he had sung on her voicemail, and the guitar was playing something she had never heard before. He didn't look at her, didn't look at anything. As he sang, the song went on, and she began to hear things. She heard a rustle, a dry, skeletal rattling that seemed to come from the deeper darkness beyond her. The quiet rustling became laughter, like the laughter at the edges of his last song, and she began to see things appear at the tables around her. Hunched, dark little things that watched Jarrett and rattled that hollow laughter like a can full of bones or a bottle full of dead leaves. The more that appeared, the more that laughed, the laughter sounding fake, robotic, the laughter of a sitcom, and the volume seemed to rise as the tables started to fill. Jarrett played on, oblivious, calling them there as he poured out his heart, and they clustered around the edges of the stage. She was the only person here other than him, and she felt vulnerable in that sea of inky monsters. When they all turned their smiling faces to her, eyeless faces seeming to notice her for the first time, she woke up screaming. She twisted in the grip of the bedclothes, the comforter and sheets having tangled her as she thrashed around. And when she came to, she felt them grip her, and her panic became real. She could feel their hands on her, holding her down, trying to bite her with those two big teeth. There had been dozens, maybe hundreds of them, and now that they had seen her, she was sure that they would want to get her for what she had done. When she opened her eyes, though, she was alone. She untangled herself from the covers and couldn't help but laugh at her silliness. What was she doing? She'd gotten so worked up over a stupid dream. The song had gotten to her, and now she was projecting onto her dreams. Jarrett's song had been terrible to hear, but it was just a song. It couldn't get her, or hurt her, or do anything. Her door creaked open then, a skeletal chuckle sliding up from the hallway. She wanted to scream, but she couldn't quite find the breath. When whatever it was didn't immediately come in and get her, she decided to go have a look. She turned on Facebook and began a live stream. "Hey guys, it's me. I think someone's in my house. I'm hearing a lot of weird noises." She was in the hall outside her bedroom, sneaking around like a prowler in her own home. As she moved the flashlight on her phone from side to side, there was nothing there. The door to the other two upstairs rooms were closed, the stairs bare, and she could see no one in the hall. She could see the names on the screen, people commenting that it looked spooky, trying to see if she was okay. But they seemed to be her only company. No one out here could be seen, and she was ready to turn back when the door to her studio creaked open, and she jumped back a little. "There, did you see that?" she asked, but realized quickly that the camera had been facing the wrong direction. Some of her viewers claimed that this was fake, but many of them were telling her to call the police and get someone out there. She approached the door instead, wanting to see what was in there. As she approached, she heard music coming just beyond the door. The studio housed her instruments, guitars, a drum set, keyboards, various recording equipment. She often went in there to strum out a tune or jot down a song, but most of the stuff was just there for show. It was expected that a songwriter would have these things, so she did. Her chord work was sloppy at best. Jarrett had always been the gifted musician, but she still put down some lyrics now and again, and cobbled together something for a collab with this artist or that artist. Usually these lyrics came from the green binder she had stolen out of Jarrett's desk before she left his house, but no one needed to know about that. She creaked the door open, spilling the hallway light's murky glow into the room. Her hand scrambled across the wall for the light switch, but froze as the phantom chords twanged out again. She heard a snippet of her own song, sung in a familiar voice that came wafting from the corner. She glanced over and found someone sitting on her $1,500 drum set, holding her $3,000 Les Paul, crooning her own tunes back to her in what was a distinctly sardonic way. She started to shout, her hands finding the switch, but before the lights came on, she saw the musician look up and smile at her in an unsettling way. Right before the lights came on, she could swear she was seeing Jarrett there in the same suit that he had been buried in. Then the lights snapped on, and she was looking at an empty drum set, her guitar leaned against it, and an unpleasant odor still hanging on the air. "Did you see that?" she asked the viewers, her voice little more than a whisper. Did any of you see that?" There were many question marks, and asking if she was on drugs or something, and she huffed at them. "That man in the corner playing the guitar, did none of you see him?" She didn't dare claim it was Jarrett. If he was fresh in the ground, and she was already claiming to be haunted by him, people would crucify her. Most of the comments indicated that they thought she needed to get some sleep. The ones that didn't state outright that they didn't believe her, and she saw that she would get no help on this front. She signed off and left the studio, taking one more look before she left. But she knew what she had seen. Ronaldo commented the next day that she looked tired. "And you look like a guy who spends his paycheck on steroids and blow, but I'm too much of a lady to mention something like that," Crystal snapped back at him over her second Bloody Mary. Her chef had laid out quite the breakfast spread, fruit, an omelet, toast, juice, but she had no appetite for any of it. She had dozed off a few times last night, but always seemed to be awakened by that incessant chuckling. Her house seemed to be haunted by it, and it kept her awake all night. When she had finally risen around 4, she had started drinking and had yet to stop. She had taken down the Facebook Live video, but people were still talking about it. They had all seen her blundering through her house, drunk or high, and talking about things that no one could see. It seemed to have created a divide in her fans overnight, and more of them seemed to think that she was high or just shitposting for attention. The rest thought that she was stressed, under a lot of pressure right now, and maybe losing her cool. Whatever it was, no one had seen what she had seen. She lay around most of the day, going from the pool to the living room to the kitchen to her bedroom, and always she felt hounded by the soft chuckles that wafted through the air. She couldn't escape them, and as the day stretched on, nowhere felt safe from the scampering shadows that came along with her. She would see them out of the corner of her eye, see them loping just outside her vision. They haunted her. Ronaldo finally leaving altogether after she called him to check the house for the 5th time. She'd been in her bedroom, drowsing in bed, when the door had creaked open like it had last night, and she had heard the skeletal chuckle as it raked across her consciousness. Ronaldo had crossed his arms and scowled when she'd ordered him to search the house again. No. She stared at him, shocked. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. I said no. My men have searched this house, basement to attic, 4 times today. Hell, half of them have already walked off, and I don't have the heart to fire them. I'm done, Crystal. I don't know what game this is or what new drug you're on, but I'm done with this bullshit. Find someone else to keep you safe, 'cause I'm out of here." She screamed at him, railed at him, told him she would ruin him, but he and his men had left, leaving her alone with the chef and the housekeeper and the driver and the haunting creatures that constantly laughed at her. I know I'm not crazy." She was walking to the kitchen as the sun cast its last light over the horizon when the bathroom door opened, and she heard that chuckling coming from inside. The water came on as well, the tub, she thought, and she stood transfixed by the sight of the open door as it seemed to leak darkness into the hallway. She was frozen, unsure how to proceed. So she did the only thing that had ever gotten her through this sort of stuff. She opened Snapchat and started talking to her fans. This weirdness just keeps happening. The bathroom door just popped open. The water started flowing, and I'm scared, guys. Her chat log began to flood with messages, but she held the camera out, the light illuminating the dark bathroom as she came forward. The water was still running, the tub filling somehow, as she shakily walked inside. She found the switch and flipped it, the light not coming on, despite how many times she flicked it on and off. The water in the tub looked black, but that could have just been the room's lack of light. Then the surface burst, and Jarrett came out, his wrists trailing blood. "You're really losing it, Chris. Sounds like you might be ready for the funny farm." She could see him sitting there in the bathtub, his grinning face looking cold as the phone light illuminated him. But her screen, as she peeked at it to make sure that he was in frame, showed nothing. On the screen, the tub was empty. On the screen, the tub contained nothing but the glare from the light. On the screen, the taps did nothing but gleam chromely. In the tub, however, Jarrett was writing "Crystal is a bitch" on the wall of the tub in his own blood. "Why are you here? What do you want?" she almost screamed. "You took my life, Chris, so I'm here to return the favor." "Sweet dreams," he said, waving as black hands drug him into the bathtub. She screamed as the light came on and fell backwards into the hallway, her fingers coming off the button. The whole exchange had taken less than a minute. She sat trembling on the floor as the messages came rolling in. Most of them thought she was faking it. The rest questioned whether she'd had a mental breakdown. No one believed her. She looked back on the events of the night before and felt that her life was becoming unraveled. She'd spent another sleepless night wandering through her house. The laughing voices had dogged her heels, the little shadow people running in and out of her peripheral vision. And she had posted video after video to Snapchat and Facebook of her screaming at nothing or hiding from the pursuers that only she could see. They had opened any door that she closed, invaded any space that she had hoped would give her refuge, and because of them, the cook had now left as well. Well, that had been her too, she guessed. She'd been hiding in the pantry when he'd come in to work that morning. She was crying, begging the creatures to leave her alone, and when he'd opened the door, she'd panicked. She'd thrown cans at him, screaming like a banshee as she drove him out of the pantry door. He had left in a huff, saying that he couldn't deal with this sort of behavior. The driver had pulled up about that time, and he had gotten into his car and pulled away as well. When the maid hadn't shown up by noon, Crystal assumed that she was alone now, alone with her demons. They hounded her again as she walked through the house. She moved like a sleepwalker, shooting videos sometimes, but mostly just walking around and trying to get away, trying to find some place they couldn't find her. She would make updates to Facebook, little segments for Snapchat, and her views were through the roof, but not because people liked what she was doing. Since yesterday, she had gained 5,000 new followers, but all of them just seemed to be there to watch her fall apart. They laughed at her, they mocked her, and said this was all a stunt. No one, however, tried to help her. Those fans that she had left had gone silent, and what remained just wanted to watch her fizzle out. She continued to wander around the house, her whole day kind of blurring by as she ran from the laughter, At one point she was in the hallway, a knife in her hand, as she shouted into the dark corners. That's where they lived. That's where they hid. And she could see their eyeless, leering mouths now, as she fell into a sleep-starved insanity. However, she dropped the knife when several of them dropped out of that dark corner, and her tired legs took her up the stairs and into her bedroom. She shot a video from the floor of her closet, hearing them caper outside as she sobbed and begged for someone to help her. The comments were mixed, most of them thinking this was an act, and others telling her to go confront them. She could see them under the door, though, and there were too many of them. She didn't dare go out there. She tried to show them to the people on her Facebook feed, but they either said they couldn't see anything, or just pretended to see them so they could feed her delusion. She passed out after a couple of hours and found herself in the bathroom, her house dark as the sun went down. The whole day was gone, and she was looking into the cabinet over the sink and staring at the bottle of Percocet. She'd gotten them from somewhere. People were always giving her drugs or leaving them behind. She reached out for them, not knowing what she meant to do with them, but hoping that maybe they could help her somehow. They could make the fear go away, make her feel good, maybe even make her feel safe. She was so tired. That's a great idea, Chris. Just take the whole bottle and draw yourself a bath. Trust me when I say that drowning isn't nearly as bad as they make it out to be. Hopped up on all those perkies, you'll never even know you're— Shut up! She screamed, slamming the door on the medicine cabinet and watching the glass fall into shards in the sink. She turned and found him in the tub again. And why wouldn't he be? Why wouldn't she see him playing a guitar? Why wouldn't she see him sitting in her bathtub? He had lived for the guitar, and he had died in the bath after she had taken every bit of joy away from him. In a way, she guessed, she deserved this. She had ruined him, ruined this beautiful creature, and now she was paying the price. She reached out and took the bottle of pills and made her way to the bedroom. She sat on the bed, looking at them as the sun went down, finally unscrewing the top and taking a handful before walking to the door and opening it onto the balcony. The light came on as she balanced on the tip of the veranda. I found these pills in my medicine cabinet. They helped a little, but I can still hear his voice. He's telling me how this is my punishment, how I deserve to die. And you know what? He's right. I ruined Jarrett's career. He never hurt me. I just couldn't stand the idea that he would keep living and loving, being loved by the people after I left. I'm a heartless bitch, and I deserve this. She dropped the pills then, and as the video rolled, she jumped off the balcony. She hit the pool with a loud splash, and as she sank to the bottom, her last image of this world were the creatures coming to gather around the lip of the pool. She saw a larger one, too. She saw a man-shaped silhouette as it bent down to look at her. A hand broke the surface of the water, and she saw that he was reaching for her, saving her from the depths. She hesitated, fearing it was a trick, but finally grasped the hand in desperation, coughing and gasping as she broke the surface. She looked up, panting into the face of her savior. Jarrett smiled, but it was not the smile of the Jarrett she had known. "Glad you could join us, Chris. These guys said I needed a backup singer, and I told them I thought I knew someone who would work just fine." Crystal glanced back to the pool and saw her body still floating at the bottom. That would be where they found her when the paramedics finally believed the frantic callers. By then, though, it was far too late. Be advised, ye who enter here. The crowd had been buzzing like a swarm of anxious insects, but as the deep, resonant voice spilled over them, they quieted. This is a horror fiction live show. The crowd was a-twitter with restless legs and barely contained whispers. The venue, an old playhouse that stood for another few days, was the perfect locale for this year's Halloween show. The building had a rich history of hauntings, strange activity, and a dark past that would make the ambience all the spookier. Shelley was happy that they had secured the place. The owner had seemed surprised that she wanted to use it, and they had taken relatively little to rent it. As Tobias sat on stage, Cindy on his left and Lucius on his right, the crowd sat anxiously before them. Shelley knew this was going to be a show to remember. Those with weak constitutions or questionable mental states should be advised to proceed at their own risk. The crowd began to cheer, and Shelley saw a runner of dust shifting from the rafters. Hopefully this old place wouldn't collapse in on them. You have been warned. To those who remain, brace yourself for the Sleepless Nights Horror Podcast. The applause were deafening, and Shelley knew there would be some serious editing in post to make sure that it was usable. She saw some trails of dust wafting from the ceiling as the cheers escalated, and thought about how the structural integrity of this place was likely to be poor. They had placed 500 of the show's closest fans in the rickety seats in the main showroom, and the gas lamps lit the scene in a ghostly way that couldn't be fabricated. The chandelier overhead was lit by 1,000 real candles, the effort of an hour or more, but it cast the second glow over the room that would only add to the ambience. "Make sure you keep a steady shot over the crowd," she told the cameraman quietly, and he gave her a thumbs up as he swept the crowd. When the network saw this, it would be impossible for them to refuse their proposal. The Sleepless Nights Horror Podcast was the third most popular horror podcast on Stitcher, the fifth most listened to on Spotify, and had over 1 million fans worldwide. The show had been steadily rising in the ranks, but its numbers had stagnated a few months ago. People were only so interested in scary story podcasts, and the production team had been looking for ways to boost the listeners. They had tried the usual hooks, giveaways, collaborations, longer episodes, but nothing seemed to be working. That was when Creepshow had approached them. Creepshow was an online network that streamed horror content and provided a platform for horror creators. They had been turned down by other narrators and had finally come to see if they could secure the voice and story talent of the Sleepless Nights Horror Podcast. They had wanted a test tape, something they could send to their backers to prove the show belonged on the network. Thus, here they were, shooting a Halloween episode in this abandoned theater. The showing had been good, 500 screaming fans, and Tobias's sultry voice moving among them like a cloud of death, infecting them all with excitement. Welcome to the show, folks. I'm your host, Tobias Mons, and I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight. If you're listening from home, then let me just say you're missing a truly creepy experience. We're coming to you live from the Sheridan Theater. This theater has played host to not only many of the greatest musical talents of the last 30 years, but also a host of grisly murders and suicide. The blood has run thick between the boards of this old building, and where better to tell our spooky tales tonight than right here? The audience quieted, settling in for the start of the show. The cameras panned over the crowd of expectant 20-somethings as they spoke in a hush. Shelley glanced over the crowd and had to do a double take when she saw someone standing in the center aisle. She was a lithe little thing, wearing something like a zombie costume, walking up the center stage. Her long, dark hair swayed as she came, and Shelby couldn't help but sigh as she thought, "Crazed fan." Shelby got on the radio to call security to intercept her, but when she glanced back, the girl was gone. Shelley scanned the crowd and found that no one even looked close to the way the girl had. She put it out of her mind as Tobias started his first story. Our first tale is about a man with a dream. He wants to be a ventriloquist, but the dummy he finds is anything but helpful. Submitted for your approval, I give you Wooden Nickel. As he began the story about a possessed puppet, Shelby looked down at the camera display sitting before her. The booth was set up in one of the balconies that overlooked the stage and seats. Each of the other balconies held cameras that caught the scene below from a different angle, and by the end, they would have 3 or 4 different views of the stage. They would edit everything together later, and the results would give them something cool to send to Creepshow. As she watched the camera feeds, one of the upper balcony lights began to wink, casting a flickering eyesore over the stage. Shelley glanced at the upper balcony and saw the can flickering as it hung from the railing. She had the walkie to her lips, trying to route someone up there, when she saw a murky shadow skulking up on the landing in the inky blackness. What the hell was going on up there? Those landings were supposed to be closed off. Some rogue fan would ruin this taping for them, and she took off for the stairs to see who was mucking around. When she found the padlock still on the door, however, Shelley wrinkled her brow and hesitated as she took it off. When she found the balcony empty, Shelley left in a hurry, locking the door behind her. She came back down to a shouting match in the hallway. Derek was the senior camera tech for the troupe. He was a big guy with a bushy beard and a cap snugged down over his graying hair, and he had been with the show for a while. He was yelling at Cecily, the stage manager, and she came back in time to hear him saying that he was going to leave, and she couldn't stop him. Cecily was in tears. Tears were usually not far from her, and she begged him not to go. Who would run the board? Who would maintain the feeds? I don't care. I told you yesterday this job wasn't worth my life. Ah, yes. Yesterday. They had been setting up all day yesterday, trying to get the wiring in the old theater to cooperate. The old theater had never been intended to run the equipment they were bringing in, and they had run the cables from the van and started setting up nonetheless. Everyone knew the place had a reputation for spooks. It was supposed to be one of the most haunted places in the city. By the end of the day, everyone in the troupe found out it was well earned, too. It started as things seen out of the corner of the eye. They were things easily ignored, until later, when you had time to think about it. Derek had seen something, too, and he told Paul and Mark to help him search the building earlier that day. It could be a homeless guy, he said, and we don't want to be jumped on by some meth head while our backs are turned. They spent the first hour searching the building, from attic to basement, but found nothing but an angry cat and some wasps in the rafters. When they gave the crew the all clear, those who hadn't searched milling about the alley next to the theater, everyone got back to work. Shelley would still catch things out of the corner of her eye, though. Shadows, slight movements, but she brushed it all off as nerves. She had grown up hearing stories about this place, and it was only natural that she would be a little nervous here. When they broke for lunch, Paul had already been talking about seeing someone on the theater floor. Everyone told him he was nuts, but he was adamant that he had seen someone down there. I was hanging lights in one of the balconies, and when I looked down, I saw this woman walking towards the stage. She was holding her stomach, staggering like a drunk, but before I could call out to her, she just disappeared. They brushed it off, saying the dust or the lights were playing tricks on him, but after what Shelley had seen earlier, she couldn't help but wonder. Derek's accident had happened near dark. Shelley had been setting up the stage when she heard a loud crash and Derek's bear-like yell. He had fallen into the railing on one of the boxes, the rail cracking and threatening to spill him. He was breathing heavily and looking around frantically as Shelley stood looking at him. He seemed unable to push off the rail, unwilling, and wouldn't move until Shelley and Mark came up there to get him. He was sitting then, shuddering and looking furtively around. He looked terrified. "What happened?" Shelley asked, and when she tried to touch him, he shuddered away from her. "Someone tried to attack me," he stammered, pointing to the shadow area behind the door of the box. "I turned to leave after setting up the cameras, and it was just standing there on the balcony. I thought it was one of you at first, but it weren't right. It was like a person made out of shadows. It was wearing a suit and a hat, smiling this huge, horrible grin, and then it laughed. It burst out of it, and it came towards me. Its laughter sounded like the roar of a wildcat, and when it opened that smiling mouth to try to eat me, I almost fell through the railing as I backed away. When I looked back, I was scared it was going to bite my face, but it was gone." He wouldn't go back in after that. He left for the day, and the 3 of them had to finish the preparations. It was good and dark by the time they were done, and they were all glad to be gone. None of them had seen any of those inky monsters that he talked about, but they had all seen some weird stuff out of sight. Paul had lost his cell phone too. He had laid it down on a banister and turned to find it gone. He had given it up as lost, only to find it sitting on the front stoop when they left. Mark swore that he had been pushed, almost tumbling down the stairs, but said it could have just as easily been a loose board as a ghostly hand. Nothing too weird had happened to Shelley, but she made a mental note not to be here by herself. This place just had an aura about it, an aura that was still working on Derek, it seemed. Shelley stepped into the conversation just as Derek was about to storm past Cecily. "What is going on? You two are yelling much too close to the cameras." "I saw it," Derek said, shuddering as Cecily looked blankly at him. Cecily may not have known what he was talking about, but Shelley found herself glancing around. "Where?" "Upper balcony. I saw the lights flashing and looked up to see what the problem was. I saw it up there, staring down at me and smiling. It stared at me for nearly 2 minutes before it just melted away like mist." Shelley shuddered without meaning to. He was describing the balcony that she had been on not 5 minutes ago. "Derek, I need you to go back to your post." Derek bristled. "The hell I will. That thing tried to kill me yesterday, and if tonight goes off without a hitch, none of us will ever need to worry about this kind of crap again. This is a stunt, Derek, a grand gesture to show the network that we mean business. We have an hour left, maybe an hour 30, and we're out the door. I need you to keep it together for that long. Can you do that?" Derek stared at her icily, but finally nodded. "For the show," he breathed. He turned and left Cecily and Shelley standing in the hallway. "What's he talking about?" Cecily asked, completely lost. "He had a bad experience last night. Stay with him, please," Shelley begged, wanting this to go well. Cecily nodded and went to keep Derek company. Shelley went back to the control booth. She came in just as the story reached its midpoint, and the audience was making appreciative noises. Tobias's voice rolled over them, Cindy and Lucius providing minor roles when needed. Tobias had always been the show's draw. Tobias had a voice that made people long for the darkest of dark and the worst of the worst. Tobias could tell you how a monster ripped your face off and slaughtered your whole family, and you'd still put it on before bedtime so you could drift off to his sultry voice. Creepshow wanted Tobias. Of that, Shelley had no doubt, and they would get him if she had anything to say about it. When the phantom breeze blew across her ear, she felt herself shudder like a cartoon character. Shelley turned, thinking that Paul or someone was being funny, but there was no one to be seen. That hadn't been an errant breeze, Shelley thought as she put her hand to her ear. As she looked around, Shelley felt she could almost hear a rattling laugh on the breeze, like leaves scuttling across pavement. Someone had blown on her ear, and it had smelled foul, like unbrushed teeth and tobacco. She turned back to the console, a second shudder creeping over the first. This show couldn't be over soon enough. 10 minutes later, the story ended and the audience erupted into applause. "I hope you enjoyed that story as much as I did. It's always good to learn that I'm not the only talking head out there." The audience chuckled politely as they murmured amongst themselves. "Our next story is about a phone operator who gets a call from someone a little out of their long-distance plan. Led by Lucius Moore, I give you No Name, No Number." Tobias came off stage, and Shelley went down to talk to him. He was leaning against the wall when she got downstairs, Lucius making his way through the story on stage. Shelley could see Tobias's face lit by the ghostly light of his cell phone and the infernal light of the menthol cigarettes he liked. He was smoking, a habit that Shelley had been trying to break him of. She wrinkled her nose as she directed him outside, reaching out to take the cigarette. "This place is enough of a death trap without you trying to burn it down," she chided quietly. He rolled his eyes but followed her out. "How's it going out there?" she asked when the stage door was shut behind them. "Amazing. The crowd loves this. This place." He spread his hands out towards the old building. "I can't believe you got a place like this. The ambience and aesthetic are perfect for something like this. I could almost believe it's really haunted." Shelley found herself wishing she believed it a little less, but just nodded along as he continued. "Hey, can I make a change for the next story?" Shelley raised an eyebrow. "We've had the stories listed online for weeks, Tobias. People expect to..." Yeah, I know. I want to read all of them, but this story is trending right now, and I think we should read it. It's seasonal, and I think it'll play well. Maybe we can add 15 minutes to the show for it?" Shelley made a noise that he must have found familiar, and Tobias laughed. Don't worry. If it bombs, we can cut it for the Creepshow promo. I think it'll do well, though. Shelley sighed and nodded. Okay, Tobias, but tell it last, okay? Maybe it's a special bonus story or something. He smiled. Thanks, boss. You won't regret it. He turned out to be very wrong on that account. She came back in to find Derek waiting for her near the door. I can't stay. It's stalking me. I gotta... Shelley took a long look at Derek. He was rattled. This bear of a man was rattled by something he had seen here. He was looking around squeamishly, fearfully, and Shelley was surprised when she took him by the shoulder and pulled him down to her eye level. Derek, nothing is out to get you. Now I need you to go back to your station and finish your job. But, she drew his face very close to her. Derek, you're perfectly safe. Now let's go. Shelley walked him back up the stairs, and they found Cecily looking frantically for him. I swear I went to the bathroom for 5 minutes, and when I came back he was gone. Keep an eye on him, Shelley told her, pushing him maybe a little harder than she needed to. Do not let him out of your sight. Cecily nodded, taking Derek by the arm and closing him into the little room he was supposed to be monitoring cameras from. Shelley nodded as she heard the door lock behind them and returned to her duties. She went back downstairs, catching the tail end of the second story and the beginning of the third before stepping outside for a smoke. She may hound Tobias to quit, but her vocal cords weren't the one keeping the channel alive. This whole experience was nerve-wracking as hell. She couldn't imagine having to run another one of these. Luckily, Shelley thought, she wouldn't have to worry about that kind of thing after tonight. Someone else would be responsible for these sorts of things, and Shelley could go back to just managing the show. A sound like long nails on slate turned her, and Shelley found herself looking into the eyeless, smiling face of a horror. It stood in the doorway, its body an undulating spot of human-shaped darkness. Shelley felt the cigarette fall from her numb lips as they made eye contact. What eye contact you could make with a creature that lacked eyes. Was this what Derek had seen? Had this thing lunged at her in a dark theater, Shelley would have never set foot on the grounds again. How Derek had talked himself into returning to this place was beyond her. The creature moved ever so subtly, and Shelley watched the door slam shut in her stunned face. She spent the next few minutes yanking on the door, pounding and screaming to be let in. No one answered, though. So she walked around the building, trying doors and yelling at windows. The windows refused to budge, the doors had zero give, and when Shelley tried to call Derek, Cecily, Paul, or anyone else, the calls went straight to voicemail. What the hell was going on in there? Why wouldn't anyone answer her? Surely someone had to hear her with all the noise she was making. When the screaming started, Shelley turned to the building with a cold dread building in her stomach. The screams didn't last long, though. The screams became a kind of laughing as she sat there listening. She called the police. At least she tried to. The police would come. They had to come. They were the people you called for help. They had to come when you called. Shelley didn't know what the police could do against these smiling, shadowy creatures, but she was certain that it would be more than she could. When 911 went straight to voicemail, Shelley knew that this was something different. That's when she remembered the stream. Maybe if she could bring it up, Shelley could find out what was going on inside. If nothing else, maybe she could find some way to fix it. She went to the van and opened her laptop, tapping into the stream easily enough. There was a 10 to 15 minute delay in the video, and perhaps she could use it to see what was happening inside. She saw Lucius finishing his story, and heard the applause as the camera swept to catch Tobias returning to the stage. Thank you, Lucius. What a great story. We've got a special story for you next. One about a perfect audience who seems like just what this comedian's looking for. It's not that hard to imagine such an audience if I try. The audience laughed, but some of it sounded a little strange as it rolled from her speakers. The cameras panned over them, and Shelley could swear she saw some pockets of darkness amongst the crowd. People-shaped things, like the ones that had closed the door, but they were smiling 2 wide smiles and laughing like loons. This next tale is called The Perfect Audience, and it will be read by yours truly, me. He began the story, and Shelley almost imagined she could hear the door slam in the background. He had just gotten started when Shelley heard the strange, canned laughter crackle from the speakers. It was quiet, background noise, the kind of laughter you hear on a sitcom, but she could hear it under the words as Tobias read on. Someone made a shushing sound, but whoever was laughing seemed to ignore them. The camera was on Tobias as he read, the ambient music they always used playing over the speakers. Shelley could still hear that laughter, though, and she wished the camera would pan over again and give her another look at the audience. After a few minutes, Tobias seemed to get distracted. "Okay, guys, let's have some quiet so I can tell the story." He started again, but the laughter had grown. It was odd, hearing it now as it bubbled from the windows, and hearing it there as it barely began. Was this how Cassandra had felt, knowing what horrors were to come, but being helpless to stop them? One of the cameras fell forward then, and Shelley could hear the operator trying to stop himself from snickering. His loud chuckles cut through Tobias's story, and the feed on that camera suddenly went out. The other two cameras were still pointed at Tobias, no one having noticed the operator's laughing fit, and Shelley could still hear the audience chuckling below their sightline. Tobias tried to soldier on, but the laughter became louder, if not lustier. The laughter never rose above that canned alien chuckle, but it seemed to envelop everything it touched. Tobias cleared his throat, Shelley's mind allowing her a vision of his ordinarily placid face glaring over the crowd. Tobias hated to be interrupted, something not many people knew, and she could imagine that he was fuming. "Okay, that's enough. If you're not going to settle down, I'm going to have security removed." But the laughter was getting closer. Shelley could see the crowd swelling with it as it made its way through it like a sickness. Though it stayed at that same monotonous tone, it grew in volume. You could hear Tobias's frustration turning into fear as it rolled on like a wave. The crowd came up just under the sightline, and Shelley could see them beginning to pool at the edges of the stage. The low light hid their faces, but her imagination treated her to a brief glance at the inky black faces and two big teeth of the creatures that she had seen. "Call security. Where's my manager? I need security here right..." But he stopped talking as Lucius began to chuckle. Lucius's mic crackled as he put his hand against it, but Shelley heard Tobias's gasp as the air cut harshly across his own mic. Tobias stood up, turning to Lucius as Cindy screeched in terror. Lucius kept laughing, chuckling as he fell from his chair and his legs bucked against the stage. Cindy was breathing heavily, asking Tobias what was going on, but Tobias wasn't sure. The two of them were moving, trying to get off the stage, but the chuckling audience was all around them now. The monotonous laughter was burrowing into Shelley's skull, and she felt a little like laughing herself. It was infectious. It was terrifying. It was devoid of all mirth or real joy, and was simply the sound of somebody rumbling their laughter for no better reason than to hear it. It sounded like the kind of laughter you heard in an insane asylum. It sounded like the kind of laughter you heard in hell. She could hear the broad tide of laughter that surged through the old building and out onto the street. Shelley began to wonder if this was the purpose of the building. Was it to house these things? They had seen them moving just outside their vision, but no one had questioned why the beasts were there. They were ghosts, after all. The spooky ambience was what they were here for. Despite Derek almost getting hurt, and despite all the craziness that had befallen them, Shelley had pushed forward with this. When she heard Tobias start to laugh through his fear, his laughter high and pealing before it became that monotonous canned sound, Shelley realized just how responsible she was. By the time the cameras cut out, the operators falling into fits of laughter, she closed the laptop and sobbed impotently. The police found her at a bar up the street a few hours later. They had been receiving calls after the cast had stopped and gone to investigate. They found everyone inside dead. They had asphyxiated, it appeared, but no sign of foul play could be determined. They had all simply stopped breathing and dropped where they lay, their faces stuck in a rictus of their final laughter. The police were talking about gas leaks, But Shelley knew what she saw. Those people laughed their lives away. They died from something they didn't understand, from something she still didn't quite understand. Shelley decided not to show them the footage. What good would it do anyway? As she sat in her apartment later, Shelley still felt like she could hear that pervasive laughter as it tried to worm its way into her head. She hoped it would pass in time, but she felt like it might be the last thing she ever heard. Marcus watched as the scarecrow in the $30,000 dress struck another pose. He had never quite been able to believe how much he made just by taking a few pictures. He'd been photographing since he was very small, and it was something that he had always loved doing. His mother had a framed picture of him from when he was 2, his pull-up hanging down to reveal just a hint of backside, as he took a picture of a cardinal in their front yard with his Sesame Street camera. She liked to say that that chunky yellow camera had been the start of his whole life. "You took it everywhere with you, Mark. We finally had to hang a lanyard off of it so you could wear it around your neck and wouldn't drop it so often." The camera he was using now was probably more expensive than his mother's monthly mortgage payments. Or they would be, if he hadn't paid her house off a couple of years ago. She had been so worried about how she was going to pay it off after his dad had died, and it hadn't been that much in the end. Marcus was glad to do it for her. His mother had always been his biggest fan, and the biggest supporter of his work. Whether it was the fridge door or the cover of Vanity Fair, she was always there. Marcus blinked as he took the next picture, pulling the camera back a little as he looked over the display screen in the real world. "Something wrong, Marky?" asked Sandra, glancing around like Marcus might have seen something on the set. Marcus licked his lips, rolling back to the last photo and checking the picture. He could have sworn he'd seen something, some dark smudge or something, but it was probably just a flash burn. Little spotting was a normal price to pay for success, but that had been strange indeed. He'd seen the spot before, but never like that. "Nothing, Sandy. I think we got enough for today. These are going to look great on your spread for Cosmo next month." Sandra laughed, walking daintily so she didn't stumble coming off the set and damage her offensively expensive dress. "For the price, they better be," she said, lifting her arms so he could unzip her. "Hey, those are friend prices. Imagine what I charge for people I don't like." She laughed, slipping the check into his shirt pocket. "Can't believe the most sought-after photographer in L.A. dresses like someone's dad out for a day at the beach." She shook her head as she said it, as if Marcus was committing the most heinous offense by just existing. Marcus looked down at his khaki cargo shorts and his polo shirt. He didn't see anything wrong with them. They were timeless, they were comfortable, and they reminded him of his Uncle Sean. Uncle Sean had given him his first real camera, and had shown him how to get the best shots. Uncle Sean was a wildlife photographer, and Marcus wished he had the guts that man had. He supposed that starlets could be just as likely to eviscerate you as a lioness, but the biting remarks usually left less trauma behind. "I like them," Mark said. "They look more comfortable than that thing." She folded the garment delicately across her arm, chuckling at him as she reached for her garment bag. "True, but this is fashion, and fashion is always worth a little discomfort." Marcus followed her out. Sandra was his last client for the day, and he wanted to close up shop so he could do something a little less flashy for a while. He stopped before turning the lights off on the set, though. Something had scuttled across his nerves, and he was looking for the source of the noise. Had it been laughter? It had to be Sandra, the echo of her chuckle, but this had sounded different. This was like that awful laughter you heard in the sitcom, the kind that made him want a mute button, just for the sound. "Coming?" Sandra asked, standing by the door to his studio as she lingered there. "Yeah," he said, clicking the switch and heading out behind her. I don't know how you do it, Mark, Sandra said as she went through the pictures. You're the only straight guy I've ever met with an eye for style like this. They were at Rogers, a bar they frequented, though the owner would likely harumph if he heard them call the place a bar. There were no pool tables or jukeboxes at Rogers. It was as far from the honky-tonks that Marcus had grown up drinking in as McDonald's was from Olive Garden. Rogers was a trendy place, a place to be seen and see people. Rogers was a place to get a cosmopolitan with your friends, but the fact that Marcus could drink a draft beer let him know that the owner was no fool. Roger wanted a trendy spot, but he also wanted to make money. Marcus snorted into his beer. I don't know if I'd call myself straight, per se. I've never really been interested in anyone, or anything but photography. Sandra flapped a hand at him. Nonsense! What about Bridget? You two dated for nearly 3 years. Marcus shrugged. We were more friends than anything. Bridget just hated to be alone, and I liked having someone home besides Sampson. Sandra tittered a little, and it made his skin crawl. Did you see who she's engaged to? He's pretty enough, but if brains were black powder, he couldn't blow his nose. They'll make some pretty babies, though, I'm sure. Marcus made a non-committal sound and took a sip from his bottle. Sandra always seemed to want to talk gossip, but Marcus found it a little tiring. He was sure that she and her friends speculated that Marcus had some man or some woman that he didn't talk about, but Marcus had been honest when he said that he'd never been into anything except photography. Oh, there had been crushes when he was younger, but he had tired of intimacy pretty quickly. One didn't become the leading photographer to the stars without a lot of hard work, and his status as a certified bachelor often helped him get a leg up on the competition. Okay, Sandra said, rolling her eyes. You really are no fun. Guess who happened to be at Sarah Grayson's Easter brunch last week? I'm sure you'll tell me, Marcus said, eyes scanning the crowd for potential clients. Darby Wheeler, she sing-songed, and she grinned when Marcus turned his full attention to her. The maestro for the Gardenia? No, the maestro for the town dump. Yes, the head organizer for the Gardenia. The Gardenia was as far from Rogers as it got. The Gardenia was thought of as a club, but it was so much more. The Gardenia was a nightclub, an art gallery, a concert venue, an impromptu gathering space for the city's richest and most influential, and elements that were so abstract that you couldn't give them a name. Only the best were invited to the Gardenia, and Marcus had been trying to gain an invitation for years. The first page of their clients list could set him up for the rest of his career, and Marcus suspected that Sandra might have his in. Well, as luck would have it, Sara set me beside him, and we struck up a conversation. Seems he's just fired as personal photographer for some indiscretion. Sandra tapped the side of her nose when she said it, and he's looking to replace him. Please, Marcus practically begged as he leaned across the table and took her hand. Please tell me you just happened to have some of my photos I took, your summer Levy spread, or something you could show him. She smiled like an imp with a soul on the line. Just so happens I had the ones you took for my Corman Winter show. He was very impressed. That really was some of your best work, Marky. And, Marcus prompted, squeezing her hand but trying not to crush it, he said he wanted to see more. He's expecting your portfolio on his desk, and I wouldn't dilly-dally. Some lucky photographer is going to get the job of a lifetime, and it really should be you. He released her hand, feeling a mixture of elation and dread settle over him. Darby Wheeler, this really was the opportunity of a lifetime. Not only could Darby set him up with the Gardenia, but he could get him into every event the Gardenia hosted. His work would likely be displayed in their newsletters, on their website, even in their gallery if he submitted it. This was huge. Darby didn't pay less than 5 figures for dress socks, and God knew what his personal photographer made. Marcus had to grab his bottle as he stood up, shaking the table in his haste. Careful, Sandra shrilled, grabbing her own drink. I want to sip this, not wear it. I got to get my portfolio together. I got to find my best shots, the perfect spread. Sandra laughed. Settle down, Marky. You won't give the job away overnight. It's Friday, and the old man won't even be in the office till Monday. You can... Then it needs to be perfect by then, Marcus said, finishing the beer in a single long pull and heading for the door. Sandra sniffed, looking a little miffed, before he returned suddenly to kiss her cheek. Have I told you lately how much I love you? She grinned. No, but a girl never gets tired of hearing it, so feel free to say it more often. Marcus put his head in his hands as he went through his portfolio. Nothing here was good enough to present to someone like Darby Wheeler. He'd done all manner of events, catwalk shows, celebrity photo shoots, but Darby had probably seen all this before. He needed something new, something different from the rest. Everything here, even the stuff that the others had raved about, seemed so bland and uninspired. What did he have that would set him apart? He jumped suddenly, a sound raking across his nerves. He looked at the TV, trying to see if he'd left it on, but the flat screen was dark, and the remote was laid neatly on the coffee table, where it always was. Still, he walked over to it, just to be sure. The sound had been very distinct, the laugh track for some network schlock that wasn't funny enough for a live audience. Marcus didn't watch shows like that. They just didn't hold his interest, but the sound of that canned laughter had definitely been what he'd heard. He looked at the TV like it might suddenly turn on, but as it stayed dark and quiet, he went back to the desk. His studio apartment made the trip nothing too rigorous, and Marcus liked the Spartan space that he'd made his own. He had folded screens around his bed, a corner for his free weights with rubber mats over the hardwood, and a small kitchen area where he did a lot of cooking and reheating. Marcus had wrapped his hand around the back of the chair, preparing to draw it out, when he heard the same mechanical chortle and turned back to the living room. He had never really thought about it, but the sound made him intensely angry for some reason. It felt like, in this case, he was the joke, and whatever was making that noise was laughing at him. Marcus didn't like to be laughed at. Made him feel small again. Marcus's childhood hadn't been untouched by strife, as any kid who grew up with a love of photography could tell you. It had gotten better in high school, his pictures at sporting events really standing out in the school paper or the yearbook, but Marcus had still contended with bullies. The bullies didn't care that he was a gifted photographer. They didn't care that he was better at 12 than they would ever be, that he would live a rich life that they could only dream of one day. They only knew he was different, and they hated him for that difference. The laughter came again, and suddenly it sounded like Freddie Hinkle, a kid who'd been dead for about 10 years now, after a motorcycle accident. Nice camera, Gaylord. Gotta go take a spread of the men's swim team for later? Marcus furrowed his brow, wondering what the source of this was. He shut the windows, thinking maybe it was something from outside. Ooh, look, guys. Little Marky's gonna go take some pictures of the baseball team. Don't forget the crotch shots. Marcus was breathing heavily, looking around fitfully, feeling like a trapped animal. Where was this coming from? Marcus hadn't thought about this in years. Freddie, Jack, Levi, even Eddie, who had gone to college with him. He hadn't seen any of them in years. No one besides Sandra called him Marky anymore, but it seemed these ghosts, or whatever they were, didn't know that. He didn't know what was going on, but he felt ice rolling down his spine as he looked around his empty apartment. Let's see what you got on this camera. Probably shots from the elementary school playground. He felt their hands on him, holding him down as they took what was most precious to him. Flowers, trash. Shit, there isn't anything good on here, man. You're so boring. Marcus gripped the waist of his jeans, knowing it would do no good. Let's give him something more interesting to look at. Marcus crumbled to the floor, shaking as he tried to push the trauma away. He had lived his whole life trying to distance himself from that scared sophomore boy who had done nothing but hang between the two bigger boys as the third one used something so precious to him to violate him in a way far more intimate than anything he'd ever experienced. They had beaten him afterwards, taking more photos, and left him weeping in the dirt behind the gym for the girls' softball team to stumble across 10 minutes later. Some had laughed, but Marcus thought that a lot of them could tell something terrible had happened here. They had kept the camera when they were done, and when his father had gone to the principal to have it returned, he had forbidden him to talk about the abuse. No sense muddying the waters, Mark. The important thing is the camera, yes? Well, let's get it back then. That was the worst part. Not the bullying, not the photos, not even having his camera taken. The worst part was his father's disbelief. He didn't want to believe that someone could do something like that to his son, would rather sweep it under the rug than believe it, so he told himself that Marcus was just blowing it out of proportion. He could defend the victims of sexual assault in the courtroom, but he couldn't believe that his son had been the victim of anything more substantial than some horseplay gone too far. Freddie had come in looking contrite, his father's hand on his shoulder looking like an iron manacle. The camera was fine, a little scratched, but still fine. It appeared that Freddie had realized what he had, and hadn't quite been willing to damage it as he had damaged the owner. He also likely realized what he had done with said camera, because the film had been gone when he handed it back to Mark with a half-hearted sorry. Marcus's father hadn't wanted to say anything in front of the principal, but he had stopped Freddie's dad on the way out and told him how it was going to be. Marcus's father was a defense attorney, a paper pusher, who weighed about 180 pounds soaking wet. Freddie's dad was a steel worker, his bare arms looking like someone had put cigarettes out on them when he was off the clock. But he had gathered the weight of what Marcus's father was telling him, and that iron grip became steel. I trust this is the last time we will need to talk about this. Your son likely has some sort of future before him, and if anyone discovered what he and his friends were doing to Marcus, then it could raise quite a few questions about the sort of man he might become. Marcus's old man had stood tall as a lion that day, and Frankie's father looked like he wanted nothing more than to warm up on Marcus's dad before beating the tar out of his son. Let me assure you, Mr. Grayson, this is the last time your boy will have any trouble with my boy. Marcus saw Frankie wince as the fingers of that hand dug into his collarbone. If it ain't, you call me, and I'll reiterate the talk we're gonna have when we get home. Frankie'd come to school the next day with a shiner and a limp, and he had never been closer to Marcus than to say excuse me on the stairs again. Marcus could still remember the hate that burned in those eyes any time he saw him, but he never approached him again, and soon his friends left Marcus alone too. Marcus opened his eyes, realizing he was on his knees on the hardwood of the apartment. What the hell had that been? A panic attack? A mental meltdown? Marcus didn't know, but as he stood up, he heard that rustle of laughter again, and no longer felt as safe in his apartment as he usually did. He grabbed his laptop and his coat, remembering to scoop up his phone as he walked to the door. He would go to the studio, he would get his work done, and he would assemble his portfolio, and he would get the hell out of here. The chuckling seemed to follow him all the way into the hallway, but it seemed to leave him alone as the door to his studio closed behind him. Are you sure you're okay? Marcus shook his head, trying to orient himself as he took the shot. Even at his worst, the shot was still perfect, and Marcus had to marvel at the way his muscle memory came into play. His shots were spot on, his delivery perfect, and as he reached for his espresso, he knew it was the mind that ran the talented hands that was failing. He had worked until first light, finally slumping over his desk as he finished the portfolio. When his phone had rung at about 9:30, he had come shakily awake to see it was the alarm to remind him of his 10 o'clock appointment. He had just enough time to get the studio ready and rush down to Casterly's for a cup of something strong and dark. The triple shot of espresso was bitter, but it was helping him to stay upright as he finished the shoot with little Miss No Name. Miss Up-and-Comer here had a rich daddy, though, and Marcus needed to pay the bills. "Yes, ma'am. I'm not about to let a late night get in the way of your order." Marcus blinked rapidly, not sure he had seen what he thought he had. It was something in the far corner, a dark thing that was down on all fours, but as he looked now, it was gone. He jumped. It was closer now. It had been about 15 feet from the wall. 15 feet from little Miss No Name, who was primping in her salmon prom dress. She looked like a knick-knack that someone had freshly polished, a sparkling ornament to mediocrity, but Marcus supposed this was the best she could find for the shoot. Who knew? Maybe she thought it looked fancy. She was looking at him strangely, probably suspected he was on drugs or something, and when Marcus lifted the camera again, he felt his hands shaking. The monster was right behind her, its grinning face preparing to bite as Marcus bellowed out a warning. "Look out!" he said. When he heard the angry crunch of glass, he realized he had dropped his camera. He was holding a hand out, reaching for her, but the monster was gone. "What are you talking about?" she said, spinning in terror as if expecting to find something lurking behind her. Marcus glanced around, not sure where it had gone, but he realized that his client likely wouldn't be back after this. One of the best or not, he didn't get return business scaring the crap out of girls who were barely out of high school. "Nothing," he said, his tongue sliding over his lips. "I thought I saw something, but I must have been mistaken. Please, let me get you to have a seat in the green room while I get the samples ready. Help yourself to an Evian water, and I believe there might be some sashimi in there if you're feeling peckish." That seemed to brighten her mood a little, and he had no doubt that the girl would snarf the sashimi that he had brought for lunch the day before. Whatever, he thought as he went to check his camera. Her father would pay him enough to buy a sushi boat if he wanted it. He was more worried about his camera, and he was afraid of what he would find when he checked it out. He was relieved to discover that it was only the attached lens that had a crack, a single jagged bolt that ran from corner to corner. The camera itself looked undamaged. That was good, because Marcus wasn't really looking forward to replacing a camera today. He bristled as he heard that chuckle again, the same rankling laughter that had assaulted him in his apartment. Were these creatures the one who had stalked him there? Marcus lifted the camera, his hands shaking as he snapped a picture. In the flash, he saw the grinning face of the creature as it hunkered inches from his, just waiting to pounce. Its teeth were bared, its grin most fearsome, and Marcus scuttled back on his backside as he tried to get away. The creature was flash-burned onto his eyes, the image frozen there by his fear. He snapped another, the flash going off like a bomb, and the creature hadn't moved an inch. The problem was, now there were two of them. The second had been crouched on the stage, right behind where the girl had stood moments before. They were both hunched creatures with skin that seemed to pulsate like black water at the bottom of a well. They had no eyes, none that he could see, but their faces appeared mostly taken up by teeth. They had their eyeless heads pointed at him, their teeth gleaming in the flash of the camera, and when he flashed a third time, he felt a scream hang in his throat like a chicken bone. There were more each time he popped the flash. "Excuse me, Mr. Grayson, are you okay?" Marcus turned his head, and he must have looked about as feral as the creatures who had startled him. The man, a suited fellow who looked like he planned his bowel movements ahead of time, stepped back in surprise. He put a hand up as if he might need to defend himself, and Marcus sighed as he fixed himself up a little. "My sincerest apologies, Mr. Foster," he said, getting up as he closed the door to the studio behind him. "I took a bad step and ended up falling down. You'll forgive me for startling you. I'm so embarrassed." Mr. Foster nodded, offering him a hand, which Marcus shook. "Quite all right. Nothing to be embarrassed about. I'm looking for my daughter. She had an appointment at 10. Yes, of course," Marcus said with a nod. "She's in the green room. Please help yourself to an Evian." Mr. Foster nodded, smiling as he headed off to the little room that Marcus kept for clients. Marcus took one more look at the door to the studio, locking it for good measure before heading into his office. It was time to get to work. "Absolutely astounding," Mr. Foster said, swiping through the shots of his daughter as she munched happily on tuna and rice. Marcus bowed his head, accepting the compliment as Mr. Foster swiped through the photos. To Marcus, it looked pretty average, but he knew it would look amazing to anyone who didn't do this on a daily basis. The girl had done little more than glance at them, being much more interested in the remains of his lunch and the flat screen that hung in the green room. She was watching TMZ almost loud enough to cover the sound of her smacking, but not quite. Marcus thought she already had the attitude of a starlet, so he supposed she was halfway there. Marcus heard the sound of tearing perforation and looked up to find Mr. Foster holding out a check. "With a little extra," he said covertly, "for the buffet." "Oh, you don't," Marcus said, but the man was pressing the check into his hand with a grin. "It's my pleasure. You do amazing work, young man. Come along, Clarice. Your tennis instructor is waiting for you, and we still have to get you changed." She whined a little on the way out, but Mr. Foster was insistent as he let her out. He thanked Marcus again, the two shaking hands, as he told him that they would definitely be back if she needed more photos for her portfolio. Marcus watched them go, preparing to walk back inside when he saw a strange individual making his way towards the studio. The audacious figure looked like he had straddled the line between an upscale pimp and a shabby don. He wore a pinstripe suit with a matching bowler hat, a pair of oversized driving glasses blocking out the sun that the hat failed to get. He wore alligator shoes that clashed with his suit badly, and a fur cloak that made him look like some sort of ancient king who was very likely sweltering in the early summer heat. The sound of his cane, as it talked on the concrete, reminded him of the birds around their home when he was a kid, the ones who smashed snails in the garden wall for tasty treats that lay within. "Marcus Grayson?" the man asked, his voice rich and cultured with just the slightest hint of a European accent. Yes, sir, but it's appointment only, and..." "Oh, I'm not here for pictures, son. I'm Darby Wheeler, and I've spent all morning being told how I just must meet you. May I come in? It's very hot out here, but fashion requires a certain amount of suffering." Marcus was speechless. Darby Wheeler at his studio. "Marcus, I said a certain amount of suffering. If you leave me out here much longer, you will need a snow shovel to clean me up." Marcus snapped out of it, apologizing as he showed him inside. He started to take him to the studio, but instead he brought him to his office. The green room still smelled of sushi and Midwestern dreams, and he was afraid that it would offend Darby's sensibility. His office was a little cluttered, but it would be easier to conduct business there. "So, what brings a man of your stature to my humble studio?" "Oh, fate, destiny, or more likely it was the constant stream of compliments from your friend Sandra Neesmith. She's quite fond of you, and if you were thinking of proposing, I would do so before she bursts." Marcus laughed, almost certain that he had guessed who had facilitated this. "She and I were seated near each other at today's Citizen of the Arts delegation, and she gushed the whole time about your work and how much of an asset you would be to my projects, and on and on and on. I ignored her for the first half hour, but after 2 or 3 hours of listening to her tout your praises, I had to come and have a look for myself. I must say you are very humble." He indicated Marcus's jeans and ratty t-shirt. but I am aware of the eccentricities of your breed. So show me your work and let's see what all the fuss is about." Marcus could have kissed Sandra and strangled her at the same time. She could have warned him, could have let him prepare for what was coming. As it stood, he had only what he had pieced together the night before, and as he pulled the tablet off the table and scrolled through the appropriate collection, he felt mighty unprepared. He had grabbed his best, the best of the best, the pictures that stood out to him as worthy, but it all seemed so pointless now. Had he thought these were good, he wondered? Had he really thought they were the best he had to offer? As Darby scrolled through them, Marcus felt his stomach fluctuate. It was all so shallow. Why had he shown him these? They were all so common, so mundane, so... "Your friend did not lie, it seems," Darby said, nodding his head as his eyes stared eagerly from behind those thick glasses. "You have a gift, boy. If the last photographer I had on retainer had been half as good as you, he could have done all the blow he wanted. Do you have any such proclivities? Are you a doper, a boozer, addicted to medications?" Marcus shook his head. "No, sir. I enjoy a drink, but rarely to excess. I haven't done drugs since college, and then it was just a little weed. As for medication, I have some muscle relaxers in my medicine cabinet, but I only use them when I have a spasm." Darby quirked an eyebrow, and Marcus saw they were cut very aggressively. "Are you a sex pest? Perhaps you have a proclivity for children or animals?" Marcus wanted to be offended by the question, but he found himself shaking his head instead. "No, sir, I have a sneaking suspicion I might be an asexual, but I've never given it much thought. The work has been the only thing I've ever been attracted to. I love being a photographer, and it's what I've always wanted to do. It's the only real skill I ever had, to my father's chagrin, and it's all I ever wanted." Darby was nodding, but he still hadn't put away the eyebrow. "Word of advice, kid. Develop some vices. No one trusts anyone in this scene who hasn't found a skeleton or two in their closet. I won't lie, though, it would be nice to have someone on my crew I didn't have to worry about having to bail out of jail for a DUI or crime of a particular nature. I think I'd like to give you a chance, Mr. Grayson." As he spoke, he had been fishing a contract out of his pocket, complete with a fancy silver pen. "That is, if you'd like to have a chance taken on you." Marcus didn't have to think about it very hard, but he made himself slow down before signing his life away. Let me have a look at this, Mr. Wheeler, and I'll bring it by tomorrow if the terms are acceptable." Darby cackled and smacked Marcus on the shoulder. "Not a complete fool, either. Yes, I think we're going to get along very well." He said his goodbyes, leaving Marcus to read over the contract. Marcus, however, could barely contain his excitement. He had done it. He was in. He was going to work with Darby Wheeler. He was going to be the photographer for the events at the Gardenia. He honestly didn't care if this contract indentured him to that crazy old man for the rest of his life, he reflected as he laughed long and hard. He had arrived. His time had come. He was drunk as a lord, and he wasn't sure if he was holding Sandra up or she was holding him up. They had started to take a cab back to his place, but the thought of hearing those whispers for so long ago had sobered him up. He told the cabbie to drop him off at his studio instead. Sandra had laughed. "You sleeping at work now?" she slurred, leaning against him. "Got some new nosy neighbors," he said, sounding unconvincing, even to himself. He invited her in, but she declined, saying that she'd grab a cab home. "I want to get comfy and drink a jug of water, order something greasy from DoorDash, and take either the food or the driver to bed, depending on which one is less greasy," she joked. Marcus paid for the cab, tipping hugely, and waved as she sped off for home. He was through the doors when he remembered the laughter and the creature from earlier. Maybe he should have gone back to his apartment after all, but he would have rather dealt with a whole herd of monsters if it meant he didn't have to hear the voice of his bullies again. He could still feel their hands as they stripped him, the humiliation of being photographed as he lay naked in the dirt, the pain as they beat him. The memories were burning the alcohol out of him, and he stumbled to his office so he could pass out before it was completely gone. When he got there, he was greeted by something that didn't make any sense right away. Someone had torn up the contract that Darby had left him. On the pieces, in what appeared to be red ink, they had written "refused" and "under contract." The words blurred a little as he tried to make sense of them, and the lines kept separating and coming back together, as if a drunken mind was trying to force it to make sense. At the bottom, near the signature line, someone had signed Little Marky, and beside it they had written Child Photo Star. Marcus was breathing raggedly, his liquor-soaked brain trying to make it make sense. That's when he heard the laughter. It was louder now, no laugh track from another room, and as Marcus came out of his office, his hands scrambled for something that he could use as a weapon. They found the camera with the cracked lens instead, and Marcus held it to his chest like a talisman as he stepped into the hallway between the studio and the rest of his office. "Who's there?" Marcus asked, his voice sounding far from sure, and when the door to the studio slid open, he heard his teeth chatter. "Marky," came a whisper from the studio, and Marcus felt the hair stand up on the back of his neck. "Who's there?" he bellowed, taking a shaking step towards the door. "Come on, Marky," croaked the rotted voice of his long-ago bully. "Don't keep us waiting. We just want to take a few pictures." He stumbled to the studio, little as he wanted to. Most of the drunken revelry had burned away now, and he was left with only the heavy tar of dread within him. He walked into the studio on legs that weren't his own and found a familiar scene waiting before him. There were 4 mannequins on the stage. 2 of them gathered around a third as the 4th took pictures with a familiar Sesame Street camera. The mannequins were smiling, all but the one on the ground, and Marcus couldn't help but notice that this one was the only one without clothes on as well. The mannequin on the ground wasn't just smiling. He wore an ear-to-ear grin that showed off more teeth than a mannequin had any business to have. "Who's there?" Marcus yelled. When the lights went out, he was left with nothing but his own ragged breathing. Marcus poked his foot around blindly, trying to orient himself as he froze when he heard the sound of scuttling hands and digging claws. Without thinking, he engaged the flash. They were behind the 4 on the stage, their numbers growing like a wave of tar behind it. The collection of creatures seemed endless, a rising tide of tar beings, and Marcus was backtracking at a jog as the flash dissipated and he was left in darkness again. He didn't want to see them, but his mind needed to know. It was like a man in the depths of a cave, lighting matches just to remember what fire looked like. The tide was rising before him, and as the lights went out again, Marcus was sobbing silently from the wall of the studio. He couldn't find the door, he couldn't find an escape, and his mind still screamed to have the flash. It would kill him, he knew this, but he was a creature of the light. He needed to know, even if the knowledge was something he died for. But he pushed back against it. He began to slide along the wall, looking for the door, but he wasn't as careful as he thought. When the camera slipped from his hand, the shatter of breaking glass was coupled with a sudden flash of light. The black wave rolled over him, and as he was pulled beneath it, he heard a syrupy voice that echoed in his pounding head. Finally, we have someone to properly commemorate our masterpiece.
Faith sat at the keyboard and prepared to create. The document cursor blinked cheerfully at her as she waited for her muse to inspire her, as it had before. She had written 3 best-selling novels and 1 turd sandwich that she was still trying to swallow. Her ill-chosen break into the world of adult romance, 7 Sons, had bombed about as hard as a book could. But it was time for Faith to get back on that horse and try again. After a year of producing nothing but bad traffic for every book reviewer who read 7 Sons, her bank account was starting to dwindle, and it was time to mount that horse or put him in the barn forever. The whirring of the blades let her know they were close behind her. It had been a 1 in a million chance, a chance at freedom or a chance at death, and Cadence had beaten the odds, it seems. She should feel lucky. Most people in Fairest only looked at their tickets every week and felt like losers. Cadence was the lucky lotto winner, but not of a prize that anyone wanted. Cadence had won the right to be killed by her friends and neighbors. Cadence had won the right to... A spidery laugh crept from behind her as her fingers froze on the keys. She looked around the office, trying to see where the source of the laughter had come from. Was the TV on? The laughter hadn't sounded normal. It had sounded mechanical. She wondered if maybe the TV had come on in the living room or something like that, but put it out of her mind as she went back to writing. The laughter had rankled her. She'd spent far too long being laughed at. 7 Sons should have been a hit. The formula was there, the chemistry was there, and with her name on it, it should have sold just as well as the other 3 books. It was the story of a noblewoman stranded on a desert planet with a series of suns rising one behind the other. The planet was barren, a wasteland, owned by a despot and his army of mercenaries. The woman's only chance for survival was to take sanctuary with the native Barsonans, who opposed the Baron. She falls in love with Fabian, a desert guide who leads her to their king, and their love blossoms in the shadow of war. It should have been a hit, a romance sci-fi masterpiece. It had bombed almost before she'd even released it. Cadence looked at her mother, that pillar of strength in a world of perpetual disappointment. Her father and brother were still for once, their forks stalling and their rooting through the contents of their TV trays. They looked at her now with something other than their usual indifference. They looked at her now like a pack of wild dogs looking at a bowl of steak. They knew what killing her would net them, and they didn't care about the ties of blood that bound them. Failure, came a gentle chuckle in her left ear. Cadence shuddered and twisted violently in her chair. She looked around the room furtively, trying to find the source of the voice. It had to be the TV or something. There was no one else in the apartment but her. It was early evening, the shadows gathering outside her window, making her think that dusk would settle soon. She'd only been up a few hours, preferring to write at night. What use did she have for being awake during the day anyway? Just one more reason for her editor to yell at her. This was all her fault anyway. She was the one who had suggested trying something different. They had been at lunch when she told her about her intentions to write a romance novel. They were sitting in Louie's, out on the patio, and Joyce had asked her if she'd thought about her next book yet. This was back when she was still the golden child of Norma Publishing, her 5 years on the New York Times bestseller list still fresh in their mind, and Joyce had been wild to get her next bestseller. "A romance novel?" she asked, squeezing lemons into her tea. "It's not really your thing, but it couldn't hurt." "Well, I was thinking of doing something in a romance sci-fi, but with more of an emphasis on the romance." Joyce nodded, the ice cubes clinking in her glass. "Well, it doesn't sound too bad. As long as you can write a romance as well as you can write science fiction, then I'd say we should have another hit on our hands." Turns out, Faith couldn't deliver in the end. "Run, Cadence," her mother shouted,
and Cadence felt her feet guide her back towards the kitchen. As her father lumbered to his feet, the TV tray spilling onto the carpet, Cadence heard his feet tangle in the tray as he went down. Her two brothers, boys she had helped raise while her mother was at work and her father was in an inebriate coma, came lumbering up as well, and she threw the kitchen door back into Brett's face as he ate up the carpet with his runner's legs. He made a sound like a tapped keg of beer and stumbled back, but Travis shoved the door and was in the kitchen before she could escape out the back. Cadence cried out as she struggled with the locks, tears streaming down her face as she expected to be caught in Travis's hands any minute. She shuddered as that scrabbly laughter scuttled across her eardrums again. She looked over at the window, but knew it was closed. Besides, no one laughed like that. No one except the audience in sitcoms. The laughter was fake. Fake as her blonde hair. Blondes sell more books, Joyce had said, so her muddy brown hair had become a dazzling blonde. No glasses on any of the book jackets that bore her picture either. The contacts changed her eyes from green to blue, and thus Faith Moore became Faye Moore, with nothing but a little makeup and some well-placed deception. No one except the people she'd gone to school with knew what she looked like. No one besides the people she'd gone to school with ever laughed at her. Cadence heard the grating of wood as someone grabbed the chair from the table. "No good," said that spidery voice, but she ignored it. She yanked at the door again, but realized that the second deadbolt was still on and twisted it fervently. She gritted her teeth against the laughter of that make-believe audience, her life beginning to feel like a bad Friends skit. See Phoebe struggling to write something. See Rachel bent over a spreadsheet as she worked. Watch them suffer, watch them toil, and listen to the audience lap it up. That was comedy, right? Watching somebody else struggle, while you sat back and watched. She heard the heavy thunk of the wood, and believed that she must go unconscious at any minute. He would brain her with that chair, had probably already brained her with the chair, and she was just lying on the floor as her head went right on believing she was conscious. She would wake up in the less-than-loving arms of the Lottery Commission, if she ever woke up at all, and that would be all for her less-than-impressive 20 years of life. She caught the dark spot out of the corner of her eye, that cradle of darkness, and imagined that she could still see something hunched there. What was it? She didn't know, but she felt certain that she would feel something watching her from there. As the night came on outside and the shadows stretched into true darkness, Faith became more and more certain that something was watching her from that pocket. Was it making the laughing noise she was hearing? Was it what she was afraid of now, as she sat working on her manuscript? As scared as she was, her well-trained fingers kept right on tapping away, too locked in their own monotony to stop now. They called to her, these creatures of darkness. They wanted her talented hands, her nimble mind, to write for them an opus. They needed her, but she was afraid. Faith feared what lay within that darkness, that soupy moor of uncertainty, but as she denied them, she only stoked their desire for her. Their trade was fear, their nourishment hopeless mirth, and they needed her smiling face to... Faith had been watching the darkness and not paying attention to her fingers. She growled as she erased what she had written, returning to the story of Cadence and her unlucky lotto night. What the hell had that been? Faith had never written anything like that in her life. Heck, her sci-fi was even considered a little too dystopian to really fit the genre. She wrote stories about heroines in their late teens who subverted expectations and toppled greedy hegemonies, the usual soulless crap that readers 25 to 35 ate up and told their friends about. That had been the problem with Seven Sons, she now realized too late. The audience didn't want a love story. They wanted the same cookie-cutter situations that Faith, or rather Faye, always brought them. Leave the horror for the guys like King and Kuntz, and leave the romance for paperback sections at grocery stores. Faith knew her place now, and she wouldn't be sliding out of it again. There had been a time, though, hadn't there? Faith put it out of her mind as she typed, but it refused to lie down. There'd been a time when she'd stepped into that darkness, a time that she didn't like to think about because it made her feel strange. "Come on," Travis said, and Cadence realized he'd been pushing the back door open as she sat cowering. "The chair won't hold for long. If you're gonna run, now's the time." Something was in that shadowy corner. Faith just knew it. From the corner of her eye, she could almost see it grinning at her. She could feel something like tiny prickles slinking up her back. The thought of someone being in here made her feel very vulnerable. In the 10 years she'd lived alone, she had never felt so isolated, and as she reached shakily for her cup of pens, she made sure that her hands continued typing so as to keep up appearances. Cadence just gaped at him, thankful in a way that she couldn't begin to put to words. Clearly it hadn't all been for nothing. Brett had fallen into the same trap her father had, but Travis, there was still some of the sweet boy that had always been there. She didn't thank him, didn't really feel capable of words, but she loped off like a startled deer, moving into the night as she made her escape. The cup went flying, and as it crashed into the corner, Faith made her own escape. She dashed for the door, her hands closing around the knob as her other hand flipped on the lights. She was hoping to blind them after startling them with the cup, but as the lights came on, Faith saw that there was no one to startle. Except for the small arrangement of scattered pins, there was nothing there. She stared at the spot for a few seconds before bursting into laughter of her own. She was such an idiot. Faith had gotten spooked for some reason and let her imagination get the better of her. She took a few steps towards the corner, meaning to pick up the pins, but as she bent to grab the slightly dented mesh cup, she heard a different sort of mechanical laughter as it suddenly snickered from the living room. Faith stood up slowly as she looked at the wall like she might be able to see through it. Faith walked slowly towards the door, hands shaking as she took the knob, her fear back in force. The hallway beyond was dark, but Faith could see the soft light of her flat screen lighting the living room with an eerie glow. She put her back to the wall, slowly creeping up the hall as she tried to stop her teeth from clattering together. She could hear the banter between two familiar characters, and Faith believed that the TV might be playing an episode of How I Met Your Mother. Faith could see her cream-colored sectional as she came closer and saw the remote sitting in between two cushions, right where she had left it. She reached around the corner, feeling for the switch, and as it came on, she leapt around, preparing to catch whoever had turned the TV on. The living room and the kitchen were clean, the chain and the bolt still engaged on her front door, and the house was empty, other than her. Faith pursed her lips, walking over to the couch and picking up the remote as she switched the TV off. She had cut Ted off in the middle of his complaint, but it hardly mattered. Faith had seen this episode loads of times. She hardly needed to see it again. Faith had watched a lot of TV in the past year, her mind too flustered to think about much. She had stayed on her couch as she tried to ignore the reviews online for Seven Sons, not wanting to see all the hate they had spilled there. The book had been a total flop. People had bought the book thinking it was more of her dystopian works and were not impressed by a love story. They said that Lady Stasian was a paper heroine with no real use other than to give male characters something to chase, and they found Fabian to be too familiar to any number of other characters. They compared the book to Dune or Star Wars or any number of other books, and not in a positive way. The reviews were cutting, often snide, and they just seemed to be used as an excuse to make fun of Faith. How could a writer so talented put something like this out? How could she read over this and think it was a good story? The characters were two-dimensional and sort of ruined the vibe of her book once I realized that it was not even her first offense. Someone at Norma Publishing was asleep at the wheel when they thought this thing was finished. Faith had started out trying to defend her work, but after a while, she just stopped going online to check. Joyce didn't seem to mind her going to ground. Her reputation at Norma had soured a little, though they could still take some of the responsibility for the book. They had published it after all, and a lot of Joyce's frigidness seemed mean-spirited. Faith shook out of her funk, finding herself just sitting and staring at the dark TV, and got up as she prepared to get back to work. Joyce would change her tune once she had sent out her latest work. Lotto night would be her return to the written world, at least for something rather than scorn and laughter. When she got back to her desk, however, she was in for a surprise. Her manuscript was gone. The document she had left open was closed, and the file was nowhere to be found. She searched the desktop, the trash bin, and the folders on her desktop, but couldn't find anything. There was no trace of it. There was nothing there, all except a new document that she couldn't recall having seen before. The title was The Old Manuscript. Faith clicked on it, certain it hadn't been there when she started looking. The longer she read, the more she came to doubt that she had written it. These were things that Faith hadn't thought about in years. A girl once befriended a shadow. Her sisters were afraid of the strange shadow that often scuttled across their room, but the girl was taken with it. She thought the shadows were funny, them and their big smiles. She would stay up sometimes and watch them as they played, giggling at them as they scuttled across the ceiling and walls. Even at such a young age, she began to create stories about her shadow friends. She created a place for them to go during the daytime, things for them to do while they waited for night, and adventures for them to undertake as the sun shone down. She whispered the stories at night to the shadows, and they were enraptured by them. No one had ever talked to them before. Most people were just afraid. The shadows loved her stories so much that they let her peek into their strange world, showing her their world in her dreams. The lands of Strange were much different than she had imagined, and the girl began to write about the places she saw there. The shadows were making something, assembling people that the girl didn't know, and the more she saw, the more she wrote. The adventures of her shadows became less friendly, less childish, but more accurate. She became their chronicler, and the more she wrote, the darker she felt. Gone was the happy little girl, and in her place, she became a quiet child. Her parents didn't understand her new job, so they sealed it away. The lady made her forget in her slow, powerful words, and the girl forgot her shadows. They sealed her words away, not quite daring to destroy them. But though forgotten, the shadows were never gone. When her family died suddenly in the night, the girl was the only survivor. They laughed and laughed at the shadows' antics, but the girl could only watch in horror. She went away then, the lady making her forget again before the memories could hurt her too badly. The shadows, however, the shadows remembered, and bided their time. It grew darker as she read through the story. The more she read, the more she remembered, and Faith could feel the tears spilling from her eyes. How had she forgotten? How was it even possible to have forgotten? Her Aunt Terry had taken her after the incident, the police calling it a gas leak, and taken her to Dr. Winters one last time. The woman had made her forget, taken away the real memories like she had before, and now it was like a magic picture you couldn't unsee. She remembered now. She remembered being woken up by her sisters screaming as the shadows scrambled across every surface of their room. She remembered her parents bursting into the room just as her sisters began to chuckle. She remembered her father getting angry, thinking this was all a joke, but then beginning to chuckle himself. They laughed and laughed as she sat there in horror, the smiling shadows filling the room with midnight, until she blacked out. She woke up on the back porch as an officer shook her awake. She had dreamed of them sometimes, but Dr. Winter had done her job well, and they were never seen as anything but simple nightmares. She could feel them surrounding her again, see them approaching her from the shadows, but her fear was tempered with something else. She turned in her chair, watching them come closer, and the smile that tried to stretch her face was confused as the tears continued to fall. They came towards her, and Faith scooted back until she realized she was trapped. They had pushed her up against the desk, and now she was stuck in the trap they had created. Despite it all, she felt the desire to laugh creeping up her throat, like the start of a cold after a good night's sleep. As she cringed away, one of them extended a hand to her. Faith saw an ancient box held in it, and she knew what would be inside when she opened it. Still, she was surprised to see the curling edges of her original bunch of stories nestled at the bottom. She took it out, holding it between her shaking hands like an ancient relic from a bygone time. "We need your writing again, Faith," the shadow said, smiling hugely as its voice rasped out oddly. "There's a project that we need your beautiful mind to see to fruition." Faith tried to answer him, but her words were lost amongst the racking laughter that scuttled up her throat. Her laughter sounded odd, brittle, like the laughter you heard from the windows of an insane asylum. It sounded like the laughter you'd hear rising from the pits of hell. The laughter wouldn't stop her, though. Quite the contrary. Faith chuckled as she wrote, the smile hurting her mouth. Who cared about suns and desert planets and dystopian teens and their problems? Faith had a higher calling now, and the laughter must be served.